So good to be with you again. Thank you for taking the time to make the time to join and become a part. Jay Fuller Interviews, Jay Fuller Interviews on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Also, the Backfire podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews on Google Podcasts, Apple iTunes. And as I've stated before, I believe people's stories make our stories better. So take the time, listen, unlearn what you thought was right to relearn what is right and just live differently. One with a tremendous story is the one, the only Glenn Stout. Glenn, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
So as you are aware and others are aware, during the pandemic last year, I started this podcast, YouTube channel, just having conversations with people because I enjoy hearing people's stories. And first question is, how have you survived this last year?
I think I've actually had a pretty easy time. I feel very fortunate. That's sort of because I've been working at home for 25 years. So there wasn't that dramatic change for me that I think there was for a lot of other people. And many of my connections with people or writer friends have always been a little remote. We talk on the phone more than we see each other. So that's, I feel very fortunate that way. And I think we were also lucky that, this has been a time where you've wanted to look around the corner and have something around the corner. Right. And there wasn't anything around the corner for a lot of people, but I was very fortunate. My daughter recently had our first grandchild. So we were looking forward to that. And then I had a book coming out. So I was looking forward to that. As we were just discussing, I had hip replacement surgery. Well, I was looking forward to that. So, now everything is done. So I go get my second shot tonight or this afternoon. So I feel like, good to go. And, everybody stayed healthy. And, my friends and family did as well. So I feel very, very fortunate for that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Glenn Stout has a new book, Tiger Girl. I apologize. Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, not Tiger King. I'm going back a year. So a couple quick questions about writing. For me, I have discovered the 4-color pen, if I can show that, the 4-color pen. But I just discovered this, and it's kind of hokey looking, but the 5-color highlighter. And so when I'm writing, a dangerous writer. Yeah, when I am writing, I'm finding these almost too enjoyable. And not that I'm so organized that I color code everything, but I find it has been helpful. What's kind of like a helpful tip that you found along the way that just you use all the time now?
Well, the one that I share with everybody, which I think is really useful, is what I call the font trick. And when we're writing, it's always great if we have several weeks that we can set something aside and then go back to it. It looks fresh. Reality being what it is, deadlines and things like that, we don't always have that opportunity. Yeah. So I came up with something that I call the font trick to kind of give myself that distance when I'm editing a project or when I'm getting towards the end. I need to look at it with fresh eyes. And that is, I'll go into my document and I'll change the font size. I'll change the font so it looks different. And just because it looks different, all of a sudden you see it with fresh eyes. And it becomes so much easier to edit, becomes so much easier to see what you've done. And to, the words aren't on the same place on the page. And you don't realize the degree to which you kind of skip over things. So when you look at it in a new font size, maybe even change the margin, do whatever you want. Don't put it into, Comic Sans or something, but something that's still readable. I don't like Arial, so I will move it into Arial because if I like something in Arial, then I really like it.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah, but, I think that's like a really good trick. I've shared it with a number of writers. It works for just about everybody because it just gives you that little bit of distance that's so helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really wise and something we can learn from. When I was a director of a nonprofit, I tried to use different fonts for different words, and I was told instead of a newsletter, it looked like a ransom note. And so I have to find that balance because when I try something, I'm all in and it doesn't have the intended desire. But Glenn, so this book, Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, how much research? I mean, I'm just fascinated because I first met you through one of your books regarding the Boston Red Sox in
Right.
sports. I love sports. And so, was this something you knew about, or how did you even come across this story?
This is a story I've known about for and intended to write about for about 15 years. When I was working on Young Woman in the Sea, which is my biography of Gertrude Ederle, the first woman to swim the English Channel, while I was researching that in about 2006, I came across headlines in the newspaper that mentioned Tiger Girl and Candy Kid. I was initially intrigued simply by the poetry of those names. Who are these people? But I rapidly discovered while I was supposed to be researching Ederle and I'm reading stories about Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, I discovered that there was more to it than that. That they were not just interesting headlines, but they had a really interesting story behind them. That for a period of time, about 5 or 6 months, they were as famous as any two people in the United States, and the more I read about them, the more I realized they intersected with the jazz age in some really interesting ways. So as far back as about 2006, I decided I wanted to write a book about them. I went ahead and did a proposal, and we thought we were going to go to auction with it right after Young Woman in the Sea came out, but the 2008 recession hit.
Hmm.
No one bid on it. So I kind of put it in my back pocket, but the story wouldn't leave me alone. I continued periodically to research. And about 3 years ago, I was finally done with another project. And I said to my agents, this is the only book I want to do. And reluctantly, they put it forward. And I was fortunate enough that Houghton Mifflin picked it up. And by then it's probably for the best that the book wasn't done 12 years ago,
Hmm.
simply because more material became available. But there was no lack of material. I mean, these people were covered by every newspaper, not only in the country but particularly in the cities where they did most of their damage, Baltimore, New York City, and Buffalo. Multiple newspapers covered everything that they did for a period of time. So there was no lack of research material, primarily in the newspapers. If anything, it was a matter of wading through everything and discovering what I really needed rather than wading through everything and trying to put everything in. But that's the genesis of the story. That's how it came about.
That's really fascinating. So many questions going through my mind. I'll try to ask them relatively orderly. I just watched a movie about Bonnie and Clyde and that time period in history, and so I found it just very entertaining. But just understanding some of the factual evidence of the backstory, it was compelling. For you, was it similar with these characters, but then you realize that they're real life people?
Oh, sure. I mean, they're important, not so much because of themselves as individuals, but the way that their story interacts with the time period. And, they predate Bonnie and Clyde by about, 7 or 8 years. So, Bonnie and Clyde give you insight into the Depression era. Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid give you insight into the Roaring 20s. And it's an insight into the Roaring 20s that I think you don't get if you read F. Scott Fitzgerald
Hmm.
or if you watch The Great Gatsby. This is a working class kid perspective. They were working class kids who aspired to have everything that they saw in the movies and in the magazines. They wanted to live this fabulous life that the bootleggers were living during Prohibition.
Yeah.
But they were very real people, and I think that's the challenge with a book like this is to try to bring the characters to life, to try to humanize them, even as some of their behaviors are sort of
Right.
inhuman and not very savory, but and not to excuse anything they do, but to try to understand it in the context of the time. And the interesting thing about that time period, for one of many reasons, is there are some parallels to today. Margaret and Richard Whittemore were coming out of, World War I had just ended. There had been the Spanish influenza, a pandemic. And right after that, there was a very brief but very severe economic depression. They didn't have many options. And all around them, what do they see? Well, prohibition is in effect. Bootleggers are everywhere. There's a spirit of lawlessness. The feeling is that all the politicians and most of the police are probably on the take. This is a time where, take what you can get, grab what you can. And, they're looking at the mass media of the time, which is still pretty much the same mass media we're looking at today. It's just delivered in a different way. The age of celebrity, a time period where you can become famous for, swallowing goldfish or sitting on a flagpole. And they saw their opportunity to become famous and to live the lifestyle that they dreamed about.
Right.
And, they didn't worry about much else. They didn't worry about tomorrow. They didn't worry about consequences. They just went for it in the only way they knew how.
So Glenn Stout, make some time. Twitter, it's at Glenn Stout, and that's 2 N's, Glenn Stout. On Instagram's Glenn Stout Books. And talking Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, you mentioned the research going through the newspapers. Was that kind of surreal going back for you? Were they literal newspapers that you were just trying to research and look at?
Primarily, I'm looking at microfilm. Or today, we were very fortunate in that there are some, website services that have taken newspapers on microfilm and digitized them. Makes it easier to search. Yeah. But you're literally going through, like when you're looking at microfilm, you're scrolling, scanning page by page by page. It's the same process I've used to do historical sports books. I liken it to, if I'm writing about the 1918 World Series and there's a particular play in the World Series, a double play ball to the shortstop, well, the challenge is to make that cinematic, is right. To make that three-dimensional. And fortunately, by looking at multiple accounts of the same event, whether it's a ground ball to shortstop or whether it's a jewelry heist, you come up with enough detail from a number of different reports that you put that all together. It's almost like a 3D printer. You're layering all the detail on top. So suddenly it's not just a simple jewel heist, but you see the people getting out of the car. You see them walking into the jewelry store. You see the reactions of the people in the store, all from reported information, and you build it that way. So the process, people say, how can you write about true crime when you've been writing about sports? The methodology in the process is identical. I'm relatively familiar with the 1920s from several other books that I've used that have intersected with the 1920s. So that really wasn't a challenge. I knew how to do this, and I was extraordinarily fortunate in regard to Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, is that there was so much reportage about them. It wasn't a question of not having enough. It was probably a question of, deciding what to use and not going overboard and trying to keep the story moving along and not have you bogged down, give enough context for the time and the place, but keep the story moving.
So when you were doing any research, did you allow yourself to get sidetracked or wonder what else was taking place through that microfilm, like how much groceries cost or what was going on in the world of sports? What was something that was intriguing that you found out just about life in those days?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's how I discovered them, is because I allowed myself to get sidetracked. I always follow my curiosity. And I certainly did it while doing this book as well. And that's how you come across some details that really allow you to enhance the story, to make it that three-dimensional, cinematic experience. One instance of that would be, just discovering, the context of like automobiles then. The 1920s was the first time that everyone had automobiles. And you see this fixation on automobiles with Richard Whittemore in particular. Every time they have a big score, it seems, he goes out and he buys one of the most expensive cars that's available. At one point, he has something that's called a locomobile, which cost about $8,000 in cash, which was the same kind of car that the Astors drove and other, high society figures in New York City at the time. Another time he buys a brand new Cadillac, and then just looking at the clothing of the flappers, for instance, and placing Margaret as a flapper, and then examining the role the flappers had during that society. Because this is a time period where women kind of for the first time were allowed some agency over their own lives. They weren't necessarily stuck at home, but they could go out at night. They could be independent. They could make their own decisions. Well, Margaret is the first generation who was allowed to do that. Now, she made a lot of bad decisions, but nevertheless, it's interesting to look at her in that context of the first generation of an independent woman able to live life on her own terms.
So, Glenn, talk to me about that balance filter. I can't think of the right word when you are talking about true crime, but for some reason, when we watch movies, read stories, there's this sense of cheering for the bad guy. How did you work through that process of sharing what they did, but also just telling the story and for the entertainment value that it is?
Well, it's on the entertainment side, that a lot of that kind of comes from the press coverage at the time. This is the beginning of the tabloid newspaper era. And so I didn't have to do cheerleading about them, so to speak. I allowed the tabloids to do that because the tabloids very quickly realized that one, crime sold, and in regard to Margaret and Richard Whittemore, that they were a romance, a couple, and they marketed them, so to speak, as this romantic couple. And younger people, other flappers and sheiks, that's what the flappers' boyfriends were called then, sheiks, they responded to Richard and Margaret not with disdain, not with horror because they were committing these crimes, but with envy. They saw in their story some of their own aspirations, as kind of limited and twisted as they are. So I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to endow the story with that. That was embedded in the story already. And, as far as entertaining, it is entertaining, again, I think, in the way that it intersects with the era, because I get to describe cabaret life. I get to describe the impact of jazz. And as I mentioned before, the clothing and the lifestyle, and just, you're coming out of the Victorian era, and this is the beginning of the progressive era, and all of a sudden everything is wide open. You can go to the movies, everything is electrified. You can go out at night. Everybody has telephones. You can connect with other people. It's pretty much the modern world that we're still living in today. The medium of delivery of everything is different. It's digital now.
Sure.
But, you're still experiencing some of the same things. People are obsessed with music. They're obsessed with movies. They're obsessed with celebrity. That's our world today. And it's interesting to watch them come into that right away and become enthralled with it. They kind of loved being the center of attention. And I think the people that were swept up in their story lived vicariously through them.
Glenn Stout, make some time, glenstout.com. Again, 2 N's in glel. Glenn, I'm sorry. We're talking about his latest book, The Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid. Where did these nicknames come from?
Yeah, well, Tiger Girl, it was the name of a movie starring Lillian Gish. It was originally Tiger Lil, and then they called it Tiger Girl. It kind of referred to a woman who was both kind of sensuous and sexy, but also innocent. And in the early 1920s, the press adopted it, and they loved stories about young women, flappers gone bad. And there was a particular young woman, a 16-year-old in California, who, was embracing this new era, and she wanted to go dancing, and her mother would not allow her to go dancing. So she killed her with a hammer. The press called her Tiger Girl, because here's this 16-year-old who looks so innocent, yet at the same time she can be incredibly violent. And they started to use that name for any flapper gone bad. And when Margaret was arrested for the first time with her husband, this was in Philadelphia in an apartment, and when the police burst in, somebody hit the lights, and Margaret's first reaction was to grab the guns and pass them out to the other gang members. The police saw that. It was reported in the press, and the press called her Tiger Girl. Candy Kid didn't come until later, until Richard was arrested for the last time, and they also then arrested Tiger Girl and realized they had this massive criminal gang enterprise robbing jewelry stores going, and they knew that she was called Tiger Girl. I think they wanted a nickname for him, and they found the perfect one, because Candy Kid has a number of meanings. One, a candy kid at the time was someone who was a sweet talker. He could talk a girl into anything. And Richard, although he was in many ways, like a sociopath, he was also very glib. He could also turn on the charm. People liked him. That was one meaning of Candy Kid. Candy was also slang even back then for drug use, particularly cocaine. And the gang did use opiates and cocaine. And then the third meaning of that is, again, something that's still in use today. Candy is also slang for jewelry, particularly diamonds. Yeah. So the Candy Kid fit Richard like a glove in every way you possibly could. And then when you paired Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid in a headline, boom, now you had a romance. You didn't just have a singular crime. You had a romantic coupling, and one that could be sold on the street corner every day by the newsboys. And they did that.
And so, Glenn, and I'm not trying to make a political statement, but whenever you say you're not trying to make a political statement, you're probably making a political statement. So I grew up here in central Vermont. My dad, he's hunted for years and years and years. And so we have hunting rifles, handguns, all of that. But this time period in history, it seemed though it was like the wild, wild west as far as guns, and you could get whatever you wanted, whether it was directly with this story or right around this time period. What is the fascination with guns? Was it just power at that time, or is it kind of the same as now? It's kind of power, but also that show that you have something that others don't. So control, power and control.
Well, a lot of it was power. And I think the other thing is that, World War I put guns in the hands of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of American servicemen who, went over to Europe and were accustomed to handling guns and grew accustomed to the power of guns. And then when they came back, a lot of them, because of prohibition, went on the other side of the law, and they were, running liquor and working protection and things like that. And, everything was a cash business then. You were carrying around money. You weren't stashing it in banks. You were actually carrying cash. Nobody was being paid by checks. So, payrolls were being delivered. And guns became, I think, kind of integrated into American urban life in a way they really hadn't before. For one, there were a lot of them because World War I put a lot of guns into the market. There also wasn't a whole lot of control on guns. And, one of the points I bring up in the book, too, it was an extraordinarily easy time to be a criminal. Identities were very fluid. You could be whoever you wanted to be. Investigative procedures for police were still relatively primitive. I mean, fingerprints were being used, but more for identification rather than investigation. So in terms of Richard Whittemore, for instance, he used any number of aliases along the way. When they were living the high life in New York, in his building, he was known as Horace Waters. And when he was out in the cabarets, he was known as John Vaughn. And nobody really knew what he did, except that he had a lot of money. If you had a lot of money back then, people probably assumed it had something to do with prohibition, with running liquor, but nobody asked too many questions. There were a lot of people making a lot of money off of prohibition in one way or another. I think it's funny because when people would ask Richard what he did for a living, he would just say sales. And that seemed to answer all the questions. And as long as you had cash on the barrel, no one asked many questions after that. But guns were pretty much everywhere. And that's where Margaret came in, because she was the quintessential gun moll. And she carried the guns for the gang, because in New York at the time, there was a law called the Sullivan Act, which was actually a pretty strict gun control law. If you were a convicted felon and you were caught with a gun, you were probably going to go to jail. So the gang kept most of their burglary kit, their big guns, their handcuffs, masks, things like that, in a locker in Penn Station. And before and after every job, Margaret would go to Penn Station, retrieve the guns, and then after the job, collect them and bring them back. And they used her because, well, a cop was likely to look the other way if it was an attractive young woman. She might be able to talk her way out of it. She might be able to play dumb. She didn't have a record. It kept the rest of the gang from being at risk. That's what a gun moll was. And I think Margaret, in many ways, is the archetypal gun moll. That's the main role she served in the gang. She didn't participate in the actual robberies, except for on one occasion, but she certainly benefited materially from the robberies, and she certainly played a supporting role in the gang.
So, Glenn, interest of full disclosure, I've not read the book, but I've started the book on Audible, and I've found like the first few chapters really fascinating and entertaining and well done. So congratulations on that. But for you, when they came across and said, we want to make the audio version, was there a temptation where you wanted to read it, or how does that all play out? Because I know some authors, they would love to have an audio book, but that never is an opportunity for them.
Right. I would have loved to have had the opportunity to read it, but I'm also wise enough to know that there are people who know how to do that. And I actually put the question out on Facebook to my friends. I said, I'm just curious, when they told me they wanted to do an audiobook, would you prefer a male reader or a female reader? Because I don't listen to a whole lot of audiobooks. And the feedback came back is that most people preferred a female reader, which was fine with me. But the real serendipity is that a friend of a friend, somebody who I'd met, but I don't know him well, he answered immediately. He says, this is who you have to get, Christina Delane. He's involved in acting in Vermont, and he's known her for years. She's an actor, and she's one of the premier readers of audiobooks in the country. Her books win awards. People listen to books read by her simply because she reads them. And so he put me in touch with Christina Delane, and we were able to work that out. And I think she does a terrific job. She really is responsive. I try to write with a little bit of sound and pace and rhythm.
Yeah.
The words aren't random. I want them to sound well too. And I think she's extraordinarily adept at bringing out the voice of the book that I wanted it to have, at the same time without making it sound cliched or sing-songy or overtly theatrical. I think she allows you to slip into the story in a very natural way. She's absolutely terrific.
So, Glenn, when does this hit the big screen?
Well, I hope it does. I mean, I have received some sort of soft queries already in regard to film rights. Right now, The Young Woman in the Sea, the book about Trudy Ederle, that's been placed with Disney Plus, and all indications are is we'll probably go into production on that this fall. I'm hoping that Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid kind of follows in that pathway, because I think the story is one, it's just very entertaining. Two, it's sort of set up to be a real nice period piece, and it features a romance. I think it could work as either a feature film or an extended series. I hope somebody, maybe somebody listening today who's moved from California to Vermont for the pandemic, hears this, or a friends of a friend. I think it will probably get optioned. Whether it turns into an actual film or not, it's hard to say. They say the odds are 1 in 1,000 once you get optioned of actually reaching the screen. So I'll cross the fingers and see what happens.
Is there a scene from the book that you would like a specific cameo in?
I think I would probably best be served, maybe in the background in the club chantilly with a cocktail in front of me, where I don't have to have a speaking part, but can just, maybe wear a nice looking jazz suit, and maybe have a flapper nearby, if not on my knee. That would be plenty for me.
And again, Glenn Stout making some time. Glenn2ndstout.com. The name of the newest book is Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid. How many books are you up to now, Glenn?
If you count books I've ghost written and edited and all that, this would be book number 100
Wow.
done over the last 30 years. So I'm kind of both mystified by that as to how it happened and also very proud of it. Of course, some of them are very short and written for the juvenile market. And like I said, some of them are anthologies I just edited. But nevertheless, it's gratifying not only to have book 100, but also to have a book that I first thought about 15 years ago and didn't abandon and had faith in and persevered, and finally to see it come out and to get the reception that it's gotten so far, which has been, positive, as positive as I could dream, is very, very gratifying.
And Glenn, thanks again. You've been so generous with your time. A few quick questions, and then we'll get you out. Could you just share the story again about what first inspired you to write, and how nervous were you with your first creative writing class back in high school or middle school, whenever it was?
What first inspired me to write was, I think I was about 14 years old, and we had an assignment in an English class to find some poems and to illustrate them with, pictures we'd cut out of magazines. And, at that point, I think the most serious book I'd ever read was probably The Baseball Life of Mickey Mantle or something like that. So like poetry. But my brother, who's 4 years older, had a book and he handed it to me. And it just so happened that one of the poets in the book was Langston Hughes, the African American poet of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s and 30s. And I encountered a poem, probably one of the first poems I'd ever read other than Casey at the Bat. And it was called Suicide's Note. And it went, "The calm, cool face of the river asked me for a kiss." And that image of someone leaning over, looking at their reflection in the water, pondering the end of their own life, that hit me over the head like a hammer. And I just was stunned that words could be so powerful. And at that moment, I decided this is what I wanted to do. And I did take that, creative writing class, and I was on the school newspaper. And I wasn't really afraid of writing back then. I've actually looked at some of the stuff I did back then, and for as bad as much of it is, I'm also still really thrilled by how I didn't realize there were any borders on what I could write about or what I could do. And I think that's the most important thing for a young writer, is to have the opportunity to write a lot and to write about anything. And, don't worry about getting things published. Just get your words out there, start working that word muscle. It's like if you play guitar, you got to learn the chords first, and it takes a long time. And I'm really, really fortunate that I had a really supportive teacher in high school, the journalism teacher, who let me write whatever I wanted in the school newspaper. And she still gets a copy of every book that I
Oh,
write,
wow.
because I'm so appreciative. Had that not happened and I'd not had that support, who knows? You might just move on to something else. But she encouraged me every step of the way.
Now, you mentioned that you don't listen to a lot of books, but do you read a lot? And do you read for fun, or do you read for research?
I've been able to read a little bit more for fun in the last 6 or 8 months, partially because of my hip, partially because I'm in between projects. Working on the best American sports writing ate up a lot of my reading time. So in recent years, I haven't been able to read as much as I've wanted to. But I'm getting back into it, and that's been really fun, reading books by writers that I've worked with and writers that I've known, that I've never had the opportunity really to read them very much. And that's been really enjoyable to see how other people are doing other nonfiction stories like this. Um, you know, I'm still doing, another version of the sports writing book, but my work with that, even to this point, is sort of over. So going forward, I will have time to do some more reading. I'm not sure what my next book project will be. I'm pondering a few things, but I haven't dove into the research yet. So I'm kind of enjoying this downtime. Every book kind of exhausts you. You're like a balloon with no air in it. And I think after that, you need to put air back into the balloon. And part of that is reading other people and getting that muscle working again. So you're not thinking about the book you just wrote, but you're thinking more wildly. You're leaving yourself open to become curious about something else.
And Glenn, how we concluded the first interview last year, you shared a story about September 11th in a book that you had written and just identifying with the characters. I do apologize, I don't have a graphic for that book, but could you just share once more about how important is it that writers but readers can identify with the characters, even the Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid? It's not necessarily to emulate their actions, but we can certainly learn from anyone, whether we voted for them this time or last time, or we got the vaccine or didn't get the vaccine. I just have a big push now that if we take the time to learn from people, then that will make us better. But so often we take the time to point out the faults or differences. But what say you? You're the author. I'm just the talker.
Well, it's all about, understanding. And I've always believed, and I still believe, that, the role of storytelling is that it allows us to know each other. Whenever we meet a stranger in any context, you might exchange some greeting or whatever, but the moment you start sharing stories with each other, you're sitting in a restaurant or a bar, or you're sitting outside somewhere and you talk about the weather with someone, and then all of a sudden maybe somebody starts telling you about a storm they experienced, and you respond with a storm you experienced, or they talk about a game they saw and you say, oh, I was at that game, and you start telling stories to each other. That's the moment when strangers become not so strange. That's the moment when we begin to know each other. And I think that's the impulse that's behind all kinds of storytelling, is that's the way we connect with each other as people. You don't have to, want to be Candy Girl or Candy Kid and Tiger Girl, but you start to understand them, and you can have discussions with people. When we write something, we don't want it just to sit there and disappear. We want the reader to be able to take it and go to someone else and say, you've got to read this. Well, you've just created a shared experience between two readers. Now they have something to discuss. I think that justifies being a writer.
Yeah. So good. Again, Glenn Stout, thank you for making the time and just sharing. And this book, Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, if you are a slow reader like myself, get the audio version or get both. And then you can read along as you listen to it, as I do often. But Glenn, we thank you for the time. Again, I say final question like 4 times. Everybody can tell I'm a pastor because I have like 15 conclusions and I never stop. But you said you aren't certain about your next book. Do you think you want to go back to sports, so to speak, or do you kind of like looking at this historical, or is it just whatever the opportunity gives to you?
Well, I mean, some of it's opportunity, some of it's just curiosity and interest. I don't know if I have much more I want to say about sports. I mean, I wrote a lot of sports history. That market is sort of not there in the time periods I'm interested in that it once was. So who's to say? I'm looking for projects that will, I never thought I'd write about a woman swimming the English Channel either, but I got intrigued by that. So I'm just kind of sort of going to leave my mind open and see what sticks, see what keeps tapping me on the shoulder and, scratching my ear that says, you really need to look at this more. You really need to write this, which is exactly what happened with Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid. So, I think that's a real lesson. If I can find something that's intriguing and interesting enough to keep my curiosity going for a period of time, then I think it's likely that the same thing will happen with the reader.
Well, that's Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid. You said it was like on your mind for 15 years. What kept you motivated to keep going back to that? Or was it just randomly you had thoughts of like, oh, I remember this project?
Well, some of it was stubbornness because I couldn't believe that that it was turned down the first time. Yeah. Some of it was also just like fear. I mean, I've told other people, I said, I had a Google alert for Richard Whittemore and the Candy Kid for 15 years because I was so sure that the story was so rich that somebody else was going to discover it. And no one did. And the longer that happened, the more anxiety I felt that, it's really going to be up to me to tell this story. I felt like, the same way the gang felt when they knew that there was, a safe full of diamonds. I knew it was there. I just had to wait for the right time to get into it. And that's, sort of what I feel happened. I mean, the timing is right in a lot of ways, even though there's a pandemic and this is a very tough time to sell books. We're sort of coming out of that. I think this is like sort of a nice escape for people. I hope to see people on the beach with this book. If you just need to turn off the volume of the present and drop into an entirely different environment for a few hours, that's what books like this can do, and do it in an interesting way that's also sort of thought-provoking and intriguing.
Oh, certainly. Glenn, thanks so much for making the time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Let that heal hip and enjoy your grandchild. So, Glenn, wish you all the best.
I will. Thank you very much, Jeff. I always enjoy talking to you.
And again, Glenn Stout makes up time. Jay Fuller Interviews, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and also the Backfire podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Anchor, and Google Podcasts. Make the time to listen to someone's stories, unlearn what you thought was right, to relearn what is right. Makes us all better and gives us more friends around the world as well. Thanks all.